The door to the clinic opened with a soft, almost imperceptible creak. A cold draft swept into the sterile room, making her shiver as she glanced toward the entrance. Her heart skipped a beat. There he was, the doctor. But it wasn't who she was expecting. For a moment, everything felt like it had stopped. She had prepared herself for an older, more experienced doctor. A woman, maybe, or someone in their 40s who could reassure her with a warm smile and a sense of authority. But standing in front of her was a man who looked no older than herself. Early 30s, maybe? His sharp jawline, dark hair, and calm yet piercing eyes took her by surprise. He was strikingly handsome in a way that made her feel instantly uncomfortable. Her pulse quickened, and her palms began to sweat. This wasn't right. "Hi, I'm Dr. Jameson," he said, his voice smooth but almost too perfect, too controlled. It didn't match the nervous fluttering inside her stomach. She blinked a few times, trying to steady herself, but all she could do was nod. "Hi, Dr. Jameson." Her voice came out softer than she intended, almost like a whisper. Her mind raced. What's going on? How did he end up here? She'd been to this clinic before, a reputable place known for its highly skilled medical professionals. Her appointments had always been with older, experienced doctors. What was this younger man doing here? It wasn't just his age that was unsettling. There was something about him that didn't sit right. The way he carried himself, the way his eyes didn't just look at her, but studied her, as though he was sizing her up. Was he trying to figure out something about me? She shook off the thought. No. Stop it. Focus. The door clicked shut behind him, and he moved toward the desk with quiet confidence, taking a seat. She noticed his tailored suit, the way his fingers tapped lightly on the wood before he opened a file. A doctor in a suit? That's not typical for this place. So, tell me, what brings you in today? His voice broke her thoughts, and she almost jumped. Her mind struggled to focus as she fumbled through her words. I just need a routine checkup, she said, trying to sound casual. But as she spoke, her gaze flickered toward his hands. His fingers were long and elegant, the kind that seemed to belong to someone who was used to handling power, not someone who should be working in a medical field. Routine checkup, he repeated, and his smile was almost too friendly, too reassuring. Great. Let's get started then, shall we? The way he said it made her uneasy. There was something oddly professional, but also strangely personal about his tone. She nodded again, but her heart pounded. Just get this over with. He started by asking the usual questions: health history, any issues she'd had recently, medications she was on. All the standard stuff. But something was different this time. He was making eye contact for just a little too long. His smile lingered a little too much, as though he was deliberately trying to make her feel at ease. Why is he so perfect? There was a calmness in him, almost as if he had been trained to handle situations like this, not just as a doctor, but as someone who had been groomed for something more. But she couldn't place it. No, stop. Just focus. He shuffled through the papers in the file, making small talk as she sat there, uncomfortably quiet. Her mind kept circling back to the nagging feeling that something was wrong. But what? What's going on here? Then, without warning, he stood up. All right, I'll need to examine you now. Please make yourself comfortable. Her stomach twisted. She knew the procedure. It was standard for a gynecological checkup, but she wasn't prepared for how nervous she felt now. Why am I so nervous? She stood slowly, her body stiff. As she turned to lie on the examination table, she glanced back at Dr. Jameson. His eyes were on her, but there was no judgment in them, only a look of curiosity, of deep, intense focus. Her breath hitched as she tried to shake off the feeling of unease. He's a doctor. He's here to help me. Just get through it. She closed her eyes for a moment, attempting to calm her racing heart. She heard the soft rustling of papers as he adjusted something on his desk. The sound, oddly enough, made her feel more alone in the room than she already did. When she finally opened her eyes, he was standing right beside her, a small, reassuring smile on his face. "You're doing great," he said, and for the briefest moment, his hand touched her shoulder in an almost reassuring way. It was professional, yet something about it felt oddly intimate. A surge of panic rose inside her chest. "I shouldn't feel like this. It's a simple checkup." But something in her gut told her that it wasn't simple. Not anymore. She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the sterile ceiling above her. She heard Dr. Jameson's quiet voice again, but this time it was different. He wasn't talking to her about the exam, he was speaking to himself, almost like he was talking about her. "So, you're the one. The girl who everyone talks about. The one with the perfect grades, the one who's always quiet, always in the background," he said, almost under his breath. Her eyes shot open. What did he just say? She stared at him in shock. Did he just say what I think he said? Dr. Jameson looked up at her, his face the picture of calm. He had caught her staring, and instead of looking embarrassed, he simply smiled, that same, knowing smile. "Don't worry," he said, his voice almost too soft. "I don't mean anything by it. I'm just making conversation. But you're different, aren't you?" Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she managed to ask. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. It was like he was studying her. Dissecting every part of her. She felt exposed, vulnerable. And yet, in the strange tension that filled the room, there was also a strange sense of comfort. Then, finally, he spoke again, his voice now lower, almost a whisper. "You don't belong here. At least, not in the way you think. There's so much more to you than you realize." Her mind raced. What was he talking about? "More to me than I realize," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Jameson's smile widened slightly. "Yes. But don't worry. You'll find out soon enough." Suddenly, the door opened again, breaking the tension in the room. Another nurse entered, and Dr. Jameson quickly moved back to the desk. His demeanor changed instantly, becoming cold and professional again. "We're done here. The nurse will help you with the rest." The nurse smiled at her politely, but she couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled in her chest. As she dressed and prepared to leave, her mind was consumed with questions. Who was Dr. Jameson really? And what did he mean when he said I would find out soon enough? She had entered this clinic for a simple checkup, expecting nothing more than the usual routine. But now, her mind was swirling with doubts, with secrets, with mysteries she couldn't even begin to understand. But one thing was clear, this was just the beginning. As she stepped into the hallway, her heart still racing, she knew something had changed. Something inside her had been stirred, and she wasn't sure if she would ever feel the same again. The following days were a blur. Work, school, and daily routines, everything had become routine again. But the feeling from her appointment with Dr. Jameson lingered, like a shadow creeping around her every thought. She couldn't shake it off. The words he had said, the way he looked at her, the way his touch had felt on her shoulder. It all felt wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint why. She tried to rationalize it. It's just a doctor's visit. He's probably just young and trying to make a name for himself. Maybe he was just trying to make me feel at ease. That's all it was. But deep down, something gnawed at her. What did he mean when he said I didn't belong there? That question haunted her every night, whispering in her mind, refusing to let her sleep. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw his smile, that strange, knowing smile, as if he knew something she didn't. The feeling of being watched, of being studied, never left her. It was as if she was living in a world where everyone knew something she didn't. She tried to distract herself. She threw herself into her work, spent time with friends, even binge-watched a new series. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was off. She had to find out what was going on. A week after the appointment, she couldn't take it anymore. Her curiosity was eating at her. She decided to go back to the clinic. But she wasn't going for a checkup this time. No, this time, she was going for answers. The sterile white walls of the clinic felt colder than ever as she walked through the entrance again. Her steps echoed in the quiet hallway, each one a reminder of the uncertainty she was feeling. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the receptionist. "Hi, I'd like to speak to Dr. Jameson," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. The receptionist gave her a polite smile. "Dr. Jameson? Are you scheduled for an appointment?" "No, I'm not. It's kind of urgent," she replied, her voice betraying her nerves. "Why am I so nervous? He's just a doctor." The receptionist glanced at her computer screen for a moment before looking back up. "I'm afraid Dr. Jameson is not available at the moment. He's out of the office today." "Out of the office?" She felt a knot form in her stomach. "That's odd. Do you know when he'll be back?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The receptionist shrugged. "I'm not sure. Would you like to leave a message for him?" She hesitated for a moment, but then the need for answers overpowered her. "Yes, please. Could you tell him I need to speak with him about my recent visit? It's important." The receptionist nodded, taking down her details. "I'll let him know you stopped by. Is there anything else I can do for you?" "No, that's all. Thank you," she said, feeling a mix of relief and growing unease. Later that evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, a sense of dread rising in her chest. The message was short but chilling. "We need to talk. Meet me at the clinic tomorrow at 10 a.m. Do not tell anyone." Her fingers trembled as she read the text again. She knew it was from Dr. Jameson. There was no doubt in her mind. What did he want to talk about? The next morning, she couldn't concentrate on anything. She stared at the clock, counting down the minutes until 10 a.m. Her heart raced in anticipation, but also with fear. What was this about? When the time finally came, she dressed quickly and left her apartment, the weight of the mystery heavy on her shoulders. The clinic felt even more oppressive today. The walls seemed to close in around her as she walked down the hall toward Dr. Jameson's office. Her breath quickened when she saw the door to his office slightly ajar. She knocked softly, then pushed it open. Dr. Jameson was standing near the window, looking out at the city. He turned as soon as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said, his voice low. "I'm glad you came. I need to explain some things." She stepped into the room, her heart pounding. "Explain? What is going on here?" He gestured for her to sit, and she did so, her nerves still on edge. He walked over to the desk and picked up a file that she hadn't seen before. The moment his hands touched it, she felt a shiver run down her spine. "I know you've been wondering about me," he began, his voice smooth, but there was a hint of tension in it now. "And I know you have questions. But you need to understand something." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "What's going on, Dr. Jameson? Why did you call me here? What did you mean when you said I didn't belong at the clinic?" He exhaled slowly, looking at her with a mixture of pity and something else, something darker. "The truth is, you're not here by chance," he said softly, as though testing her reaction. She frowned, confusion washing over her. "What do you mean?" What does that even mean? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the file in front of him. There was a picture of her, but it wasn't just any photo. It was a picture from her past, a photo she hadn't seen in years. She recognized the school setting, the same classroom she had sat in for most of her childhood. "How did you get this?" she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "It's a part of the story," he said, his voice calm. "And it's a story that's much bigger than you realize." Her mind spun. What was he talking about? "I don't understand," she said, standing up, her pulse racing. "What story?" Dr. Jameson's eyes darkened. "You're part of something much larger than you can possibly imagine. Something that goes back years. I was chosen for this, and so were you." Her head spun, trying to grasp the magnitude of his words. "Chosen for what?" "You're being watched," he said quietly. "Your whole life has been under observation. And the truth is, you're not just a student, not just someone trying to make her way in the world. You've been marked." Her stomach dropped. "Marked? What is he talking about?" He leaned forward. "I know this is hard to believe. But you have to trust me. You've been part of something from the very beginning. And now, you're at the center of it." She stepped back, almost tripping over her own feet. Her mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle swirling around her, but they didn't fit together. Nothing made sense. "I don't know what you're saying," she said, her voice trembling. "This doesn't make sense." Dr. Jameson stood up, walking toward her. "I know. But I need you to understand. Everything that has happened in your life, everything you've done, has been part of a plan. A very carefully orchestrated plan." His words hit her like a physical blow. "A plan? A plan for what?" "You don't have much time," he continued. "They'll be coming for you soon. And when they do, you won't have much of a choice in the matter." Her mind reeled. Who will be coming for me? She barely slept that night. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and disbelief. What Dr. Jameson had said to her earlier replayed over and over in her head like a broken record. "You're being watched. Your whole life has been under observation. You've been marked." She had thought it was all a mistake, maybe even a joke. But the seriousness in his eyes, the way he spoke, left no room for doubt. Was he trying to protect me? Or was he part of whatever this was? Her heart pounded as she replayed the strange events of the past few days. The clinic, Dr. Jameson, the strange texts, and the cryptic messages. She was stuck in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. There had to be more to the story. There was no way her life had been planned from the beginning, no way she was part of some grand scheme. But then again, how could she ignore what he had shown her? The photo of her, the one from her childhood, how did he even have that? What was all of this? Her thoughts swirled in circles. She couldn't sit still. Her stomach twisted as anxiety crept into her chest, and she knew she couldn't face another night like this. The next morning, she made a decision. She was going back to the clinic, and this time, she wasn't going to leave until she had answers. Answers that made sense. The sun had barely risen when she left her apartment, the cool morning air hitting her face as she walked down the quiet streets. Her footsteps were steady, but the tightness in her chest never let up. She felt like a pawn in someone else's game. But the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. "I can't let this go." The clinic was quiet when she arrived, the reception desk unmanned. She waited for a few moments, tapping her foot impatiently. The minutes dragged on until, finally, a nurse appeared from around the corner. "Can I help you?" she asked, a faint smile on her lips. "I need to speak to Dr. Jameson," she said, her voice firm despite the nerves buzzing underneath. The nurse's smile faltered just for a second. "I'm afraid Dr. Jameson is still out. He's not in today." Do you want to make an appointment? No. I need to speak with him now. It's urgent. The nurse's eyes flickered, and she seemed to hesitate before nodding. I'll see what I can do. Please, wait here. As the nurse walked away, a feeling of dread crept over her. What was going on? Why wouldn't Dr. Jameson be available again? Minutes later, the nurse returned with an unexpected answer. Dr. Jameson has left the clinic indefinitely. He's been reassigned to another location. Her heart sank. Reassigned? What does that mean? I don't understand, she said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. I was just here yesterday. I need to speak to him about something important. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do, the nurse replied softly. You can leave a message with the office, but beyond that, I can't help you. This wasn't right. None of this felt right. She was about to leave when a thought struck her. Is there someone else here? Someone else I can talk to? The nurse looked at her with pity, then glanced around the room as if making sure no one else was watching. There is someone. But I don't think you'll get the answers you want. And I would advise against it. Her heart pounded. What did she mean by that? I need answers, she pressed. If Dr. Jameson isn't available, I have to know what's going on. The nurse hesitated for a moment before nodding. Fine. Follow me. She led her down a series of corridors, deeper into the clinic, where the sterile white walls became more and more oppressive. The quiet of the building was overwhelming, making every step feel heavier. As they walked, the nurse kept glancing back, as if checking to see if anyone was following them. Finally, they arrived at a door at the end of the hall. The nurse knocked softly before opening it. The room was dimly lit, with a large desk in the center. The man who stood behind it wasn't someone she recognized. He was older than Dr. Jameson, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and a serious expression. His presence felt commanding, almost intimidating. Mr. Walker will speak to you now, the nurse said, then quickly left, leaving her alone with him. Mr. Walker looked at her, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't say a word, just motioned for her to sit. She did so, heart pounding, unsure of what was coming next. You've been asking too many questions, Mr. Walker said, his voice calm but firm. Questions you're not supposed to ask. I don't understand, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I just want to know what's going on. Why is Dr. Jameson gone? What's really happening here? Mr. Walker sighed and leaned back in his chair. Dr. Jameson is no longer your concern. You've been a part of something much larger than you know. And the sooner you accept that, the better. Her stomach dropped. What is he talking about? Larger than I know, she repeated. What does that even mean? What is going on here? Mr. Walker's gaze hardened, and he leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. You've been marked for something important, something that's been planned for years. Your life is not just your own. It never was. Her breath hitched. What does that mean? We've been watching you, tracking you, from the very beginning, Mr. Walker continued, his voice low and methodical. You were chosen, just like Dr. Jameson. Chosen to be a part of something bigger. Chosen for what? She asked, her voice shaking now. What's going to happen to me? Mr. Walker paused, studying her for a moment before answering. You're part of a larger project. Something that will change everything. We've been waiting for the right moment. And that moment is coming. She sat frozen, her mind racing. A project? A moment? What is he talking about? Before she could say anything else, he stood abruptly. You need to leave now. And you need to stop asking questions. The more you ask, the more danger you put yourself in. Her head spun as she stood to leave, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't leave with so many questions unanswered. What's the truth? Who's really behind all of this? Mr. Walker didn't give her a chance to ask anything further. As soon as she stepped into the hallway, the door shut behind her with a finality that made her shiver. She walked out of the clinic in a daze, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. You're running out of time. The next steps will change everything. Be ready. She stared at the message, her mind numb. What was happening? She didn't know how to feel anymore. Her mind was a tangled mess, a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. Each new piece of the puzzle only led to more questions, leaving her spiraling further into uncertainty. The clinic, Dr. Jameson, Mr. Walker, they were all connected in some way, and the more she tried to understand it, the further away the truth seemed. She couldn't stay idle. No. I need answers. I need to know who's behind this, and why I'm caught in the middle of it. She spent the next few days in a blur. The world outside felt like it was closing in on her, everything happening too fast, too out of her control. No matter what she did, searching through old files, calling people she trusted, looking for any hint of information, everything kept coming back to the same question: who was behind all of this? The message from Mr. Walker had haunted her, a constant reminder of the threat that seemed to hang over her like a storm cloud. You're running out of time. The next steps will change everything. What did he mean by that? What was coming for her? Her phone buzzed again as she sat in her apartment, the glow of her screen lighting up the dark room. Another message. She hesitated, but there was no turning back now. She opened it. Meet me. 8 p.m. The alley behind the clinic. Don't bring anyone. Her pulse quickened. It was from an unknown number, but there was no mistaking the urgency in the message. Someone wants to meet. Someone knows more. She didn't hesitate. If there was a chance, just a chance, she could find answers, she had to take it. The alley behind the clinic was dark and quiet, the shadows stretching long under the dim streetlights. She stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts as she glanced nervously around, waiting for whoever had sent the message. Why did they want to meet here? Why not somewhere safer? Minutes passed, and just as she began to question whether this was a trap, she saw a figure approaching from the far end of the alley. The person was dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured by the shadows. As they drew closer, she felt a shiver run down her spine. "Are you the one who called me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to stay calm. The figure stopped just in front of her. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they glanced over their shoulder, scanning the alley, as if making sure no one was watching. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over her. This feels wrong. Finally, the figure spoke, their voice low and urgent. "We don't have much time. You need to listen carefully." Her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Who are you? What do you know about Dr. Jameson? About Mr. Walker?" The figure stepped forward slightly, lowering their hood. To her surprise, it wasn't anyone she recognized. A woman, perhaps in her late 30s, with sharp features and a serious look on her face. Her eyes were tired, as if she'd been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "My name's Claire," the woman said, "and I'm here because you've been asking the wrong questions." Claire's words hit her like a ton of bricks. "What do you mean?" "I just want to know the truth." Claire's eyes narrowed. "The truth is dangerous. And you're not the first person to seek it. People who've gotten too close to the truth, they don't end up well. Do you understand that?" Her throat tightened. "What are you saying? What happened to the people who sought the truth?" Claire didn't answer directly. Instead, she pulled out a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to her. The paper was old, creased from being handled many times. She unfolded it, revealing a list of names. Her breath caught when she saw her own name at the very top. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a list," Claire said, her voice thick with bitterness. "A list of people who've been involved with Dr. Jameson and Mr. Walker, whether they know it or not. People who've been part of the project, just like you." She stared at the paper in shock. "But why is my name here? What does this have to do with me?" Claire sighed, her gaze softening slightly. "You were part of the program before you even knew it. Before you even had a choice." "Program?" she repeated, trying to make sense of it all. "What program?" Claire took a step closer, lowering her voice. "The truth is, you were chosen long before Dr. Jameson became your doctor. Before Mr. Walker ever came into the picture. They've been tracking people like you, people with specific traits. People who can be part of something bigger." "What, something bigger?" she stammered. Claire hesitated before speaking again. "I can't explain everything here. It's too dangerous. But if you want the full truth, you'll have to trust me. I can show you everything, but you have to be ready for what you'll find." Her mind raced. Trust her? Can I even trust anyone anymore? She had already trusted Dr. Jameson, and that had led her to a dead end. And now, this stranger was telling her there was more, a bigger plan, something beyond what she could comprehend. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said, her voice shaky. "How do I know you're not just leading me into another trap?" Claire's eyes softened with something that resembled pity. "I understand. But listen to me, if you don't get to the bottom of this now, it will destroy everything. You'll be stuck in this forever, and you won't be able to escape." She stared at Claire, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on her. This was bigger than she thought. She wasn't just a victim in a game, she was part of something far more dangerous. "Okay," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "I'll go with you. But I need to know everything." Claire nodded. "Follow me, then. I have a place where we can talk. And once you see what's really going on, you'll understand why it's so important to stop them." They walked in silence through the streets, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily between them. Claire led her through back alleys and darkened streets, taking her farther from the clinic and deeper into unknown territory. Every corner they turned, every shadow that passed, made her feel more and more like she was being pulled into something she couldn't control. Finally, they arrived at an old, run-down building on the edge of town. It looked abandoned, but Claire didn't hesitate. She led the way inside, and the door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, there were stacks of old papers, files, and photographs scattered across the table. She could see names, dates, and strange markings on the pages. Her heart raced as she realized that these weren't just random pieces of information, they were connected. Every name, every document, every photograph was part of a puzzle she hadn't even begun to understand. Claire turned to her. "This is where it all started," she said, her voice tense. "This is where the truth lies." She walked over to the table, her hands trembling as she picked up a photograph of a group of people, standing together in front of a building she didn't recognize. She scanned the faces, looking for any sign of familiarity. And then, her eyes stopped on one person. It was Dr. Jameson. Her heart skipped a beat. What was he doing here? Claire saw the shock on her face and nodded grimly. Dr. Jameson was one of the first. He was part of the original project, the one that started everything. And now, he's trying to keep it going, using people like you, people who have no idea what they're involved in. Her mind reeled. How much of this was true? And how deep did this go? Claire's eyes darkened. The truth is, it's worse than you can imagine. But if we don't stop them now, it'll be too late. She didn't know how much more she could take. The weight of everything Claire had just revealed was unbearable. Her mind was spinning, her body shaking from the tension of it all. She sat in the dimly lit room, her eyes fixed on the papers spread across the table. Each one was a clue, a fragment of something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Claire had been right. There was something dark behind all of this, something far more dangerous than she could have ever guessed. The more she tried to piece the puzzle together, the more the pieces seemed to slip through her fingers, just out of reach. But she had to keep going. There was no turning back now. Do you understand what you're looking at? Claire's voice cut through the heavy silence. She didn't look up immediately, too consumed by the mess of documents before her. I think so, she replied slowly. But I don't know what it all means yet. Claire stepped forward, her face grim. It means that everything you thought you knew is a lie. The clinic, Dr. Jameson, Mr. Walker, they're all part of a bigger operation. A project that's been running for years, and you're a part of it whether you realize it or not. Her throat tightened. But why me? Why was I chosen? Claire hesitated, as though considering how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. You have something they want. Something inside you. Something that makes you different. She frowned, trying to make sense of the words. What do you mean, something inside me? What am I supposed to have? Claire looked around nervously, as though checking to see if anyone was listening. You were part of an experimental program. Dr. Jameson and Mr. Walker were involved in research, medical experiments that were far more dangerous than anyone realized. They were searching for a way to harness something, a unique ability in certain people. They thought they could control it, but they were wrong. The room seemed to tilt, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. Are you saying I was part of some experiment? Claire nodded grimly. Yes. Your health problems, your visits to the clinic, they were all part of it. They've been monitoring you, tracking your every move, studying you. She shook her head in disbelief. But I never agreed to any of this. I had no idea. I know, Claire said softly, a hint of sympathy in her voice. That's the worst part of it. You never had a choice. She stood up, pacing back and forth. The revelation was too much to process all at once. Her whole life had been a lie. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had trusted, had been manipulated. But why? What were they hoping to gain from all of this? Why me? She asked again, the question hanging in the air, desperate for an answer. Claire's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharpening. Because you're special. You were chosen for a reason. She felt the blood drain from her face. Special? Chosen? What does that even mean? Tell me everything, she demanded, her voice firm now, more desperate than ever to understand the full extent of what was happening. I need to know why they did this, and what it means for me. Claire sighed, stepping closer. It's not going to be easy to hear. But I'll tell you. Dr. Jameson and Mr. Walker were part of a covert operation that began years ago. They were studying a rare condition in certain people, a genetic anomaly. It was an ability that no one understood, something that could change the course of science, medicine, even power itself. They believed that if they could find enough people with the right genetic markers, they could unlock its full potential. Her mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. But what does this ability have to do with me? Claire's expression darkened. That's what they've been trying to figure out. You have the gene. The one that's been passed down through generations. They thought they could trigger it, awaken it somehow, using medical procedures, injections, experiments. But it's dangerous. It's not something that can be controlled. Her chest tightened. So, What happened to the other people in this program? The ones who were involved? Claire shook her head sadly. Some of them died. Some disappeared. Others were transformed in ways no one could predict. That's why they needed you. You were one of the few who survived the initial phase of the program. They couldn't afford to lose you. Her heart pounded in her chest. They were trying to control me? Yes, Claire said simply. And now they're getting desperate. They need you more than ever, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep you under their control. She was shaking now, her body filled with fear and confusion. Control. That word echoed in her mind. That's what this had always been about, control. Her life had never been her own. It had all been part of some sick experiment, something far bigger than she had ever realized. I didn't ask for this, she whispered, feeling tears welling in her eyes. I didn't ask for any of this. I know, Claire said gently. But it's not over. There's still a chance to stop them. Her mind spun as she tried to wrap her head around everything Claire had said. She had never asked to be part of some medical experiment, had never asked to be part of a secret program that could change the world. But now, the truth was clear, she was in too deep to turn back. Tell me what I need to do, she said, her voice firm now. I want to put a stop to this. I want to end it. Claire's eyes softened. We have to get to the heart of it. Dr. Jameson and Mr. Walker are just pawns in a much larger game. There's someone else behind all of this, someone with more power, more influence, who's pulling the strings. If we can get to them, if we can expose everything, we can finally end this nightmare. She nodded, determination rising within her. She wasn't going to let them win. Not without a fight. They spent the rest of the night planning. Claire showed her more files, more pieces of the puzzle. They went over the names of people involved in the program, the locations of secret labs, and the people who might be able to help them. But it was clear that time was running out. The longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. As they prepared to leave, Claire placed a hand on her shoulder. You have to be careful. There are people out there who will stop at nothing to keep this quiet. If they think you know too much, they'll come after you. You can't trust anyone. She nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. The world she had known was gone. Now, it was about survival. She had never felt so alone. Everything that had been familiar, every ounce of comfort she had once known, had shattered. She was deep in it now, buried in a world of secrets, lies, and shadows. But there was no turning back. Not anymore. Not after what Claire had shown her, after everything she had learned about the twisted web she was tangled in. As she walked through the abandoned street, the cold air biting at her skin, her thoughts raced. Every step felt like it was leading her further into the unknown. She had no idea who she could trust anymore. Not Claire, not Dr. Jameson, certainly not Mr. Walker. They all had their own agendas, their own motives, and now the only thing that mattered was surviving and exposing the truth. She looked at her phone, checking the time. 8 p.m. The meeting spot. She was supposed to meet Claire again, but this time, things felt different. She could feel the weight of everything hanging over her, pressing down with an urgency that made her stomach churn. If she failed here, if she didn't stop them now, there would be no second chances. The world felt like it was closing in. Every corner, every dark alley seemed to whisper her name, reminding her of the danger she was in. The closer she got to the end of the road, the more she realized how much was at stake. Her life. The lives of countless others. The truth. As she reached the spot, she spotted Claire standing in the shadows, her face grim. The tension was palpable. Neither of them said anything at first, the weight of the situation hanging thick between them. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice low, almost reluctant. You made it. But we don't have much time. They're already looking for you. She nodded, trying to steady her breath. There was no time to waste. I know, she replied. But I have to do this. I need to stop it all. Claire stepped forward, her eyes intense. You're right. You're the key to everything. But you need to understand something, this isn't going to be easy. There's more to this than just exposing the truth. If we want to bring them down, we have to be smarter than them. The fear that had been growing inside her now mingled with a spark of defiance. I'm not afraid. Not anymore. Claire hesitated for a moment before pulling a small device from her pocket. She pressed a button, and a holographic map appeared in front of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. This is where it all started, Claire said, pointing to a location marked in red. The lab. The heart of the operation. If we can get in there and take what we need, we can expose them once and for all. Her pulse quickened. The lab. She had heard rumors, whispers, but this was it, the place where everything had been created. The place where the experiments had begun. This was the final piece of the puzzle. You're sure about this? She asked, doubt creeping into her voice. I mean, are we even going to make it out alive? Claire gave her a grim smile. There's no turning back. We'll either make it or we won't. But if you want to stop this, if you want to end it, this is the only way. The thought of it sent a cold chill down her spine. She had nothing left to lose. Her whole life had been a lie, and now she had the chance to take it all back. To stop them before they could hurt anyone else. Claire looked at her one last time, her face softening. Are you ready? She didn't hesitate. Yes. They moved quickly, weaving through the streets, staying in the shadows, doing everything they could to avoid detection. The lab was in a remote location, deep in the heart of an industrial district. It was the kind of place no one ever paid attention to, the kind of place that hid secrets far darker than anyone could imagine. As they approached the entrance, Claire handed her a small, black card. This will get you in, she said. Once you're inside, find the main control room. That's where they keep everything, the files, the research, the recordings. We need to expose it all. She nodded, heart pounding. This was it. They reached the building, an old concrete structure that seemed to have been abandoned for years. Claire used the card to swipe open the door, and it creaked loudly as it opened, the sound echoing in the empty space. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the silence almost suffocating. They moved quickly, staying low, avoiding the security cameras as they made their way through the dimly lit hallways. The place was like a maze, long corridors, locked doors, and rooms full of machines she didn't understand. Stay close, Claire whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. We're getting close. But we have to be careful. They're watching. Her nerves were on edge, but there was no turning back now. She couldn't afford to fail. They finally reached the control room, a large steel door that seemed almost too secure to breach. Claire swiped the card again, and the door hissed open, revealing a small room filled with monitors, files, and equipment. The air inside was sterile, the room colder than the rest of the building. She moved quickly, scanning the monitors. There, on one of the screens, she saw footage of the clinic, Dr. Jameson and Mr. Walker, standing together, discussing something in hushed tones. They looked almost casual, like they were planning their next move. But as she watched the footage, her blood ran cold. There, in the background, she saw someone else. Someone she recognized. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her. She stepped closer to the monitor, her breath catching in her throat. It was a recording of one of her own appointments. Dr. Jameson, speaking to her, explaining the treatments, but what was she doing here? How had they been recording her this whole time? Claire saw the panic in her eyes and stepped forward. They've been watching you from the beginning. Tracking your every move, every moment. You're a part of their experiment. But this is the proof we need. This is how we bring them down. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the files, pulling out documents with her name on them. The files were thick with information, detailing every test, every procedure. Her entire life, reduced to a series of notes, codes, and diagrams. And then, she found it, the ultimate truth. The entire operation had been planned for years, and it wasn't just about her. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of others just like her, being experimented on in secret labs all over the world. The genetic anomaly they had been searching for was real, but it was unstable, unpredictable. And it had never been fully understood. The last file she found was the most damning of all. It was a list of names, people who had been part of the experiments. But there was one name that stood out. Her mother's. Her heart stopped. Her mother? She looked up at Claire, her voice barely a whisper. My mother was part of this? Claire nodded solemnly. She was the first. She was the one who helped them start the project. But they lost her. She didn't survive the early stages of the experiments. The shock hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mother had been involved, too. She was part of the reason all of this was happening. Claire's voice was low, almost urgent. We don't have much time. We have to get these files to the authorities, expose them for what they've done. She nodded, her thoughts spinning, but she knew one thing for sure, this was just the beginning. The truth was out there now. There was no going back. As they made their way back to the entrance, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Someone was coming. Get ready, Claire whispered. It's now or never.